Hey everybody, thank you for joining. My name is Jonny Morris. I'm VP of Government Affairs and Communications at EnCharge AI, and I'm joined with Naveen Verma and Jimmy Khan for a conversation today about a very exciting milestone for our company, the Series B that we announced today. So before I get into it here, I want to just give some brief bios for both of our participants. Naveen, in addition to being CEO and co-founder of EnCharge AI, has been a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Princeton since 2009, where he's done pioneering research in a range of emerging technologies and systems. His breakthrough discoveries in next-generation computing have been widely recognized in industry and academia and have led to step-change increases in compute performance and efficiency. And he spent 6 years leading the deep research behind EnCharge AI's core technology before co-founding the company. Jimmy joins us from Anzu Partners, where he's an investment partner focused on semiconductor technologies, hardware products, and next-generation materials. Previously, Jimmy was a senior hardware engineer and researcher at Qualcomm, where he developed advanced memory technologies and sensors for low-power computing and IoT devices. He's a rarity in the venture capital world. He has a PhD in material science and engineering, as well as a BS and MS degrees in material physics from University of California, San Diego. He's a technical leader, authored 30 plus peer-reviewed papers, holds 24 plus US patents, and we're also very lucky to have him as a member of the board at EnCharge AI. So Naveen and Jimmy, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks a lot, Jonny.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Great. So I'll just jump into it. Congratulations on Naveen on putting together this really successful Series B, $100 million. Before we get to discussing the round, I'd like you to take just a little bit of time to talk about the origin of EnCharge AI. It's a company that's commercializing innovations that were developed over many years at your lab. And I'm curious if you can kind of share at what point did you know it was time to move that work out of the lab and into the startup world?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jonny. I think the truth is one never really knows, but I think that there's for me, a couple of kind of key indicators that really drove both what we were trying to do in the lab and at what point we thought about taking this thing out of the lab and moving it really into the real world, in this case, in the form of a startup. And look, I think what we're doing here and what's always been kind of the core DNA of EnCharge is a transformative technology, a fundamental technology that really approaches the problem of computing and AI in a very differentiated way. And it does that on a very fundamental level. Now, of course, when you have that sort of core technology, you need to make sure it works in what ultimately is a very complex system, right? The kinds of systems we're bringing to the market involve, this fundamental technology acting in the ways that it needs to bring that efficiency, but it needs to act in that way in an architecture. It needs to act that way together with a software stack so that all of this can come together to support, the AI ecosystem, the AI industry that we're targeting to support here. And at each of those levels, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of technical challenges. And so you imagine bringing in a new sort of fundamental technology into the mix and sort of how that percolates into changes and innovations that are needed across that stack are really wide-ranging and so on. And so I think what we recognized when we first had the fundamental breakthrough, that was back in 2017, is that we really do need to understand this in the context of that entire system. And so it was critical for us to make sure that it indeed works at the level of the architecture and at the level of the software. We did that by building the architecture, by building the software, by taping out chips that were progressively more complex and progressively more advanced nodes. We had great partners who helped us do that, folks like the Departments of Defense and DARPA, and folks like TSMC who provided silicon and so on access to be able to develop these chips and really in a concrete and rigorous way, de-risk them and prove that advantage. I think what became the clear inflection point was, look, when this is no longer just about de-risking the technology and fully understanding it, once you've done that at the level of the software, at the level of the architecture, at the level of the fundamental technology, when the next step really becomes about, okay, now we've got to align this to real customer and industry partners and to support their roadmaps and their products, which means integrating features across that stack and the software and the architecture, so on and so forth. Now the best framework for engaging with them becomes spinning out a company and building the kinds of things that you can, sort of develop and then put into their hands. And that is the kind of thing that's best done outside of academic or fundamental research. And so that to us was kind of that critical point when we felt confident that we fully understood it and were ready to really solve customer problems and commit to sort of directing all of this towards their roadmaps.
Got it. And you kind of described this handoff from fundamental research to the kind of innovation ecosystem with venture capital and commercial partners. Given the complexity of creating a semiconductor startup, is that a common pathway, or there's a lot of companies in the space? Is that something that you see across them, or is it a lot of companies are asking investors to also fund the de-risking of the technology?
I think it depends. And I think the challenge is certainly have in the semiconductor space very complex products. And as a result of that, you have very strong incumbents, folks who are established and who have built out their products and so on and so forth. When you have that environment, when you're trying to really introduce something new to solve really big problems, you need some pretty fundamental differentiation. And often that means, sort of new technologies that by their design should be very disruptive. That then also means that there's a lot of risk in those technologies. And I think that there are a lot of occasions where people see the opportunity and are ambitious about, sort of impacting the ecosystem in positive ways, and talk about and start to have concepts around new sorts of technologies that could do that, but they haven't been de-risked to the levels that they need to be. I do think that I'm in a very privileged position to have been able to have the time and space to think about, those fundamental new technologies and then to also fully understand them in the context of these complex systems. Not everyone has that advantage. And so there are cases where, sort of new technologies are immediately spun out, and now you're using venture capital money to still kind of experiment with and try. And you often, in that process, land on the wrong solutions. And the reason for that is, look, the day you take venture capital money, your agenda changes, right? This is no longer about understanding those technologies. This is really about addressing a market need. That's the vehicle that venture capital provides. So I think there is a real challenge when it comes to innovation in the semiconductor sector. For that reason, it's something that I'm actually quite committed to supporting and changing and thinking about structures that could enable. But it's one that I had the privilege to be able to address in the ways that we did at EnCharge through the role first at the university and then spinning it out.
Thank you. So Jimmy, I want to turn to you for a second. So Naveen has been in his lab, doing this research, having these breakthroughs, reaches an inflection point where he now turns and decides to found EnCharge. You came in with Anzu Partners and led EnCharge's Series A, which was announced in late 2022. How did you get connected with Naveen, and what stood out to you about the company at that time?
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. We actually first connected with Naveen while he was still at Princeton before deciding that it was time to fully spin out the company. And we also met the founding team through the DARPA network via a direct introduction by the chief commercial officer of DARPA at the time. And over the years, we've evaluated several DARPA spin-out companies, deep tech companies that are DARPA-backed research. And at that point, EnCharge already immediately stood out. And what really caught our attention was exactly what Naveen has just described, which was essentially the level of technical maturity. Unlike a lot of the semiconductor startups that really start with a theoretical concept, the team at EnCharge had already built silicon validated over many generations of relevant technology nodes with this DARPA and DoD and other funding. And that was a level of de-risking that was really hard to find in other companies at the time. And beyond the technology, the team that was coming together around this company was also a major factor for us that attracted us to it. Naveen, Kailash, and Achira, the founders, brought together this combination of cutting-edge research, industry experience, and commercial execution that was also a really rare blend. And so this understanding of how AI compute needs are really evolving over the course of time towards this need for efficiency and programmability really convinced us that EnCharge had the potential to be a really strong player in the AI hardware space.
Great. Thanks, Jimmy. So let's now dig into the Series B because that's the big news of the day. In Charge, we're developing AI accelerators at a time when AI model advancements and changes are happening at light speed. We just, had some big kind of earth-shaking developments in terms of model efficiency recently from China. Um, but that's on the backdrop of, you're going to raise a round that can take the better part of a year. You have to have a pitch that kind of is consistent and stands up to all of the changes that are happening underneath it. So Naveen, can you talk a little bit about how the AI landscape changed from when you started the round to today? And then how did you manage that change while kind of staying consistent? What things were you able to bring to investors that increased your credibility with these changes rather than decreasing them?
Right. So, to be honest with you, Johnny, the story of how we managed that change, and, kind of stayed aligned to it and so on really starts from the very beginning of the company. The dynamics that we're seeing in this AI space are nothing new. They've been here for quite some time. And I think one of the things that we recognized and committed to very early on in the company is the recognition that the space of AI is going to go through extreme innovation, and it's going to be critical for whatever it is that we build, if it truly is going to be a meaningful foundation for the industry, to be able to support all of that innovation in a totally uninhibiting way, in a way that fully aligns to and is fully able to support that. So that was, sort of, even as we were looking at the fundamental technology in the context of fundamental research, thinking about the architectures and software that would be needed, that was the highest level of commitment from the start. When we spun the company out, that was the highest level of commitment from that start as well. And even from that point, we had this fundamental technology that delivered this extreme energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is a fundamental thing. It could be used in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different, sort of challenges that are being faced in the industry. But even during that period, we saw this just rapid evolution of AI models, from kind of edge vision models to these large language models and beyond. And so I think that, when we think about the dynamics of this industry and how to stay aligned to it, on the one hand, you need to be able to accommodate and support those innovations that are happening at the model or algorithmic level and the model architecture level. But there's also another very interesting dynamic that's happening as this industry is emerging, which is, sort of the collective thoughts around how do we make AI broadly accessible? How do we make it sustainable? How do we make it available in all of the places we want to make it available? And so I think, both of those are things that needed to be managed very carefully. And I think that we're very fortunate that from the start, our commitment around supporting model architecture and algorithmic innovations, sort of allowed us to define a direction that was able to move with where the markets needed us to move to be able to support those ways of deploying it. I think what we started to see as we now zoom forward to the beginning of our Series B fundraising was that, this was kind of right around the time where, ChatGPT had happened, various, sort of players in the industry had run point proof of concepts and figured out, where there's some interesting opportunities to start to monetize AI, then went and started to do that and started to run into real barriers. And a lot of those barriers were on a couple of fronts. One is the cost. In particular, these were deployed in the data center, and the data center had very severe cost, sort of constraints and restrictions that really made sort of the broad use of these prohibitive. The other was privacy and security. There's a lot of enterprise use cases. There's a lot of consumer use cases where, sort of deploying in the data center is not necessarily the most viable thing. And so we started to recognize the importance of breaking out of some of those barriers in the data center. And we started to discover a lot of partners who, were putting together very committed strategies about moving AI into the next adjacent devices through which the data center is accessed, basically from the data center now into what we call these client devices, laptops and workstations and so on. And that's where we found very strong alignment, interest, traction from various partners. It turns out that these are power constrained devices. These are battery operated laptops, so on and so on. So all of a sudden, this energy efficiency value proposition really becomes a very concentrated advantage. And we started telling that story. But of course, this was an industry still in transition. And so at the early stages of our Series B fundraising, we had to tell the story, and it was met with many questions and skepticism. And, wait a second, isn't the trend here in the data center? You're talking about this other thing. But because of how rapid the dynamics in AI are, this is a case where it played to our advantage. Even over the course of the next few months, we started to see very strong signs and indicators from the ecosystem and the industry broadly that were supporting the story that we were telling. Even more than that, the very rapid dynamics at the algorithmic and model level started to lead to the emergence of small language models. These were initially to make sort of the cost of running in the data center more sustainable. But now all of a sudden, these cross an inflection point where these models can indeed run on edge devices on these client platforms if the hardware is adequately provisioned. So you just started to see this convergence of collective will by the industry, also innovation, which of course are driven by some of the big challenges the industry faces. And so some of those fundamentals, I think, sort of really ended up allowing our story to come to fruition. And by the time we were deep in fundraising, we were singing a song that I think a lot of investors appreciated, understood, and kind of got right away.
So that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's it's the case where if you can kind of deliver on the promise, there's a lot of people that are lined up that are optimistic about it, that will benefit from it. But one of the downsides of the semiconductor industry, as we all know, is it's incredibly capital intensive, right? So you raise all this money, but you don't get to build a bunch of chips and do a bunch of trial and error before you get to the product. We've talked a little bit about the de-risking of the fundamental technology at Princeton. But beyond that, are there ways that EnCharge has approached developing a product that kind of managed that risk that resonated with investors when you went to go raise that money?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first is really that de-risking, right? We had developed a lot of the core components that are needed here. And so our strategy became, how can we reuse those where it would be really beneficial for us to get to market quicker and get to market more economically. And in some cases, that meant that we had to make decisions about which technology node we're in. And that meant not going to the most advanced technology node. And so then we had to be strategic about, how can we leverage the efficiency advantages and performance advantages we have, not just to deliver the highest performance products to the market, but also to be able to do that in a way that's sort of capital efficient from the perspective of a company, which is equally important for us to be able to support our customers and partners on all of the different fronts that we need to support them. So that was one. I think the other is that very strong commitment that I mentioned to ensuring that our software and our interfaces to this platform are properly aligned to that innovation ecosystem and engine that we have in this industry. And that drove from the start a design methodology that was very hardware, software, co-design oriented. It's quite frankly a very unusual way to build chips, but it was one that came out of us studying where the biggest failure modes were, where do people end up spending most of their time and money when they try to bring products like this to the market. And it was really in making sure that the software and hardware are properly aligned so that you can run all the workloads that the market wants you to, but do them, in a performant way by leveraging the right features in the hardware. So that co-design became really critical, and it drove a development methodology for us, which I think has served us really well. When you do that, I think the time it takes increases because you got to do this co-design. But I think in the long run, I think it's pretty clear to me at this point that that leads to a lot of efficiency in the way that we develop and bring these products to market.
Excellent. So, we've talked a lot about the unique value proposition of EnCharge, and when you look across the kind of chip startup space, there are a lot of companies that are hoping to do a lot of amazing things, and but from the outside looking in, sometimes it's hard to tell whether they'll be able to deliver on that. And so I want to turn to Jimmy, who occupies this somewhat unique position in that you're an investment partner, but you also have a highly technical background. And so, Jimmy, I'm curious to know, when you look kind of across your colleagues in the VC space, what is the level of technical understanding that you see in the venture community when it comes to semiconductors? And to the extent that that doesn't exist, what are strategies that VCs can access to help bolster their knowledge and evaluate these opportunities to tell, what's real and what's not?
Yeah, Johnny, great question. I mean, I think that the semiconductor investing ecosystem is very varied because on one hand, you have investors that are coming from a software and services type of background. On the other hand, you have climate tech and more hard tech, deep tech types of investors. And then ultimately, you also have strategics that are coming from companies where there is a set of existing expertise that can help them. I mean, the thing to remember, as I think Naveen pointed out, is that semiconductors are one of the most technically complex and capital intensive sectors in venture investing. And so, unlike software services or some marketplaces where investors can oftentimes focus on growth metrics, semiconductor investments do require this deep understanding of process technology, design architectures, the various manufacturing risks, and ultimately, any of these can determine the success of that company or the failure of that company long before revenue scales or even before a product goes into manufacturing. And so for VCs, I think a good approach is to build a strong technical advisory network, not try to pattern match too much what you've seen in other software and services companies with what you might see in a semiconductor company. And essentially, this is engaging with domain experts, whether they're former semiconductor researchers, designers, or executives, or others within the community that have this level of technical expertise. Internally, we rely a bit on our own internal team, but also have a broad network of industry experts, of course, that helps us evaluate the claims, assess some of the risks, and identify what truly differentiates a company's technology. Another thing to look for are just the clear validation points, right? So obviously, has the company actually built working silicon? Have they demonstrated some of these results at scale? Do they have some of these de-risking through partnerships with foundries like TSMC? And do they have a protected IP portfolio? And these are all things that go into especially early stage companies in this space that are crucial.
Got it. And I'm going to kind of turn the question around a little bit to Naveen and ask you to put on your Princeton professor hat for a second. You know, across, academia and the fundamental research world, do you see sufficient linkages to that next step of the innovation ecosystem with venture capital in terms of sharing expertise and insights, or is that something that needs to be continually built upon?
No, I think for the reason that Jimmy identified, which is that some of the biggest problems that I think academia can play a role in affecting, and I think that startups can play a role in affecting. Some of those problems are extraordinarily complex, and some of them need fundamental transformations. So for that reason, I think that there is certainly efforts in academia to make those linkages to support VCs and also vice versa for VCs to support the translation of fundamental research into, sort of industrial products and markets. But it needs to be amplified more. I think this is especially true in the US, where I know, it could be argued that we have the strongest fundamental research institutions and we have the strongest innovation ecosystems. And I think that these two can offer really unique synergies in ways that we haven't even tapped yet. So I do think that it's important for both to get engaged with each other. And so I do hope that, colleagues in academia will start to play the role of those kinds of advisors that Jimmy mentioned. And I do hope that, sort of colleagues in the innovation ecosystem, VCs and so on, will start to support and look for those opportunities to, sort of incubate and harvest great ideas out of academia. And that's a pathway that's a little different than, I would say, the more conventional startup ecosystem. It takes a special kind of investor to be able to sort of, help steward that pathway together with founders. And that's very important.
Got it. And so you've found those special type of investors with this round, right? So you've put together this really impressive group. It includes leading financial investors like Tiger Global. It also includes some key strategics like Samsung Ventures and HHCTBC in the semiconductor space, and IQT and RTX Ventures in the defense space. So I'm curious to know, what was your strategy around putting this group together? How do you see these strategics helping? And kind of in addition to that, were there things that stood out about this raising this round, the Series B, that was fundamentally different from the Series A or past fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I'll say is that the set of investors that you get in a company are so critical to the path that that company takes and just to your ability to, sort of be energized and motivated. That's true more than I realized when we, spun out the company. And I'm very grateful for the, especially very early stage investors that we were able to get. I think as we start to think about in this Series B stage, right, I think you think about what are some of the biggest obstacles and challenges that we will face in, sort of really realizing our very ambitious objectives and targets for a company like EnCharge. And it remains true, we've already talked about this, that some of the most interesting challenges and opportunities are just the rapid dynamics and the ways that the ecosystem and industry is quickly evolving. So especially when we thought about financials, of course, we've talked about semiconductors as being capital intensive. You need to have the financials who can provide the backing to be able to support that. That was critical. But I think it was also critical for us to have ones who approach the way that they think about, investing and engaging with other portfolio companies through a very high resolution lens of monitoring what's happening in the market and analyzing what's happening in the market. And when I think about the financial investors, and in particular the lead investor, Tiger Global, that we were able to bring into the company here, these are the masters in terms of being able to help understand, monitor, track, interpret some of those dynamics. So that was a really critical factor for us. And I think it became more and more apparent as we got deeper and deeper into conversations with them. I think when we think about strategics, which was also a very focused effort and activity for this fundraising for us, I think we were thinking about it a lot in terms of, we've got a pathway and a value proposition that we've identified, but we see a lot of opportunities to grow in that category and in adjacent categories. So we thought a lot about, one, who I think about as kind of development partners who will bring technologies that will be very synergistic with ours and that will help us define, sort of and harness sort of the new opportunities in the AI space. So that was one category. And we talk about folks like Samsung, we talk about folks like HHCTBC and so on. And then the other category were sort of people who would be drivers of AI in new and emerging use cases. And so I think when we talk about RTX and when we talk about Constellation and so on, those I think represent opportunities where AI is right to play a really important role in very important, sort of directions and vectors. So I think there was a little bit of thoughtfulness around sort of who we would want to bring in both on the financial and strategic side in that way.
Got it. And so now that the Series B is closed, we've announced it. You have these resources. What does the rest of the year look like for EnCharge, and what are you most excited about coming out of this process?
Yeah, every time you finish a fundraising round, it's like you've gotten to the start line, right? And now is the great opportunity to actually, sort of move forward and push forward that vision that you've been selling and built such conviction around. And for us, this is really an inflection point for the company. We've spent a lot of time in fundamental research, building this technology. Then we spent some time in R&D, really working on a product and aligning that product to, customers and partners where we had these strong resonances. And now it's really about delivering that going forward to those customers and working together with them, to build an ecosystem and solutions around this so that these can now be, released into the market. So as I think about, 2025, that's kind of the point that we're at and the focus that we are going to have. And of course, part of this is also how we focus on the immediate opportunity with them. It's also about how do we, sort of continue the roadmap, knowing, sort of through our engagements with them, what the future needs are going to be, because we're in this because we expect the space of AI to only grow and expand and be more exciting.
Got it. And bringing in Jimmy, a lot of your job, Jimmy, I imagine, is imagining what the future looks like if these companies are successful. So, in your opinion, how's the landscape in the chip startup space changed now that InCharge has raised this round? And then if they're able to deliver, if we're able to deliver on the things that we're trying to do, how does that kind of change the entire ecosystem of computing?
Yeah, and as Naveen mentioned, right, I mean, with this funding, we're essentially taking EnCharge from advanced R&D to real world deployment at scale with the partners. I think it's pretty clear to everybody now in the ecosystem that, I mean, this current trajectory of AI compute demand is ultimately unsustainable. I mean, the power consumption surging, these infrastructure costs are going through the roof. And then this problem of cutting edge AI being more and more increasingly limited to those who can afford these massive GPU clusters is just a major problem. Um, how does the future change? I think it's pretty simply put. If Encharge succeeds, the companies that are developing advanced AI applications will see their fundamental economics improve dramatically as the cost per inference plummets. Um, this is going to unlock the ability to develop and deploy a much wider range of AI-driven applications that can ultimately benefit humanity, whether that's in education or in healthcare, industrial automation, or whatever you can imagine. Um, ultimately, by allowing us to have these radical efficiency gains without this massive costly infrastructure build or overhaul that we're seeing in the ecosystem right now, um, Encharge is going to be able to allow AI to scale a lot more sustainably and reach a lot more people in a lot more places at ultimately lower cost.
Got it. So we're reaching the end here. I just got a couple more questions for you. First of all, Naveen, for anybody who's watching this and is really excited about InCharge, maybe they're an engineer, maybe they think they want to contribute to the team in the future. Uh, can you talk a little bit about what InCharge looks for in potential hires and why engineers out there should be excited to join InCharge as we look to potentially grow our team following this round?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and it's one that's on our mind all the time. I mean, the reality is Encharge, our DNA is sort of technical excellence and technical innovation. And I just want to be clear about what that really means. Look, we're trying to build something that is a transformative technology, very differentiated technology. We need to execute on that because we've got people who depend on us and people who are counting on us, and we respect those people very much, given the commitment they've shown to us. So, a lot of this is about being able to execute on that, but it's also about, sort of being willing to innovate with something that's new. The old patterns of how you built architectures, based on more conventional approaches, in many cases need to be rethought. And everyone needs to do that at every level of engineering here. That's a hard thing. And it's sometimes a kind of thing that makes you a little bit vulnerable. There's this thing that I knew, and now there's this thing that I don't know. And how do I feel, sort of playing in that arena? And so part of this is about being very supportive for each other so that people can take the risks and ask the questions and propose the ideas in a way where the entire community and team around them, sort of is open and is receptive and is there to support, sort of how this idea might work, how this idea might need to be modified, how this idea might not work. So that's really what we're looking for. It makes for an extremely exciting thing. I think it's a unique thing. And we're very privileged to be able to work on something that is transformative and yet, sort of be, sort of in a position to be able to deliver that to the hands of real users.
Got it. I can certainly attest to the amazing quality of the people we have today, and excited to continue to add to that. Okay, closing question for both of you. What's one thing about the semiconductor industry that people that aren't familiar with the industry often misunderstand or are surprised to learn?
Would you like to go first, Jimmy?
Uh, sure. I think one of the big misconceptions is that semiconductor innovation is slowing down. That there's this endless talk about the end of Moore's law, but the reality is that we're seeing more innovation than ever, just in different ways. And so instead of this uh, year over year shrinking of transistors, companies like Encharge are rethinking the entire compute architecture to achieve step function improvements in efficiency in other ways. Um, I think the other one thing that's really hard for people outside of the industry or haven't been in the industry for a little while to appreciate is just actually how difficult it is to get the supply chain and the established semiconductor ecosystem to adopt something, I mean, even slightly different. Um, Foundries, the packaging providers, the EDA tool vendors, all these tool chains are like ruthlessly optimized for what works today. And anything that deviates too far from the standard process flow induces this massive friction in terms of cost, yield, and time to market. And so that's why the approach to semiconductor investing here isn't just about pure technical differentiation. It's also about making sure that companies can create this disruptive impact without supply chain disruption. Um, and the best semiconductor startups aren't the ones that really demand that the entire ecosystem change for them, but are the ones that can seamlessly integrate into the existing manufacturing workflows and the software workflows while delivering this improvement in performance. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited about EnCharge, that the technology can achieve this breakthrough in efficiency, but it does it in a way within standard CMOS processes while working essentially in harmony with existing AI software stacks. And that's really critical in getting meaningful adoption.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Jimmy, and I fully agree with all of that. So thank you for that. I think the one that I'll say is, look, people kind of forget about semiconductors, right? There's all of this innovation that happens, and we write applications and we write algorithms, and there's this thing buried deep underneath there that actually runs this stuff, and you forget how critical that is. I think that that really came into full view in great force over the last few years as we started to hit real challenges in our semiconductor supply chain and in the sustainability of the semiconductors that we rely on to run this compute. So I think there's broad recognition of that coming around, but it's also kind of mysterious. Like, how does that work and why is it limiting? And the answer is it, sort of works through this concert of the semiconductor physics and the architecture and the software, and then all of those interfaces, to the programming level that allow people to innovate. And there is a whole stack that has to come together here. So I would say that the second thing is these are complex systems, and they all need to work together. This is, I think, very well aligned to the second point that Jimmy made. But what that really means is when you think about any innovation, and there is room for a lot of it, as Jimmy pointed out, those innovations need to all integrate together into these full systems, and they all need to work together. And every part, wherever you can bring efficiency and wherever you can bring programmability and usability, really matters. And so that's the nature of the problem here, but it is so critical. This is the foundation on which innovation has always, or arguably, has always been and most significantly been built. And so that's exciting for us, certainly, to be a part of that and be in the center of it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I fully endorse that. I mean, in a prior life, I worked on trucking technology, and there's a lot of differences between trucking and semiconductors, but I think the one key thing is that once you start paying attention to the space, you realize how it's everywhere and touches everything. But most people don't stop to think about it until something goes wrong or there's a big disruption, whether it's AI or COVID or and supply chains or whatever it is. And then you start to realize just how much of any business, any corner of the economy relies on kind of continued innovation and continued processes there. So with that, thanks to both of you for joining us. Thanks to everybody watching. Congratulations again on the Series B. It's a very important milestone for the company. And stay tuned for more. It's going to be an exciting year for EnCharge. Thanks a lot, Jimmy and Naveen.